Hi, I am Javier Livas. In this video, I will explain why capitalism beats socialism. When the Berlin Wall fell 30 years ago, I thought it was a prime example of how very complex systems can undergo almost instant catastrophic change. In 1987, James Gleick had published Chaos, the Making of a New Science. The butterfly effect was also rather new, but here it was being validated. A year before the wall fell, I was laughed at when I suggested the likeliness of a German reunification to an East German diplomat. The capitalist-socialist rivalry had been deadly. That night, the wall fell without a shot being fired. Today, it befuddles my mind that young people would even consider socialism as a solution for their future. The new sciences of complexity are on the side of capitalism as a self-organizing system. The world, and especially young people, I think, are eager for an explanation about capitalism and socialism that makes sense with the world of computers and cell phones and social media that we are now very familiar with. All this happened in the last 30 years. This makes sense because the same science that brought us computers explains why capitalism beats socialism. I'm talking about cybernetics, and this is what I will be talking about. The third thing I want to clarify is this. The usual definitions of capitalism and socialism describe some of their features, but they do not provide explanations about why one works better than the other. Capitalism entails private ownership, capital accumulation, wage labor, voluntary exchanges, a price system, and competitive markets. About socialism, it is said that it entails the collective or the state ownership of the means of production and, as a consequence, centralized planning and finance. This is a description, but not an argument. Here you will find the true reasons based on science why, for instance, private ownership is better than collective ownership. It's more efficient, and why markets are wiser than centralized planning, and why liberty is a better innovator and motivator than the vague idea of the common good. I have promised to make a scientific argument, so please think about this. If you want to compare the force needed to move two vehicles, you need Newton's laws of motion. The variables are mass and acceleration. At an equal speed, the truck's larger mass wins. But capitalism and socialism are not machines. Physics does not apply. To settle the confrontation between capitalism and socialism once and for all, we do not need physics or math or even economics. We need cybernetics, the science of control. Here are three of the most important cyberneticians ever. First, Norbert Wiener, the founding father. Then we have Ross Ashby, the expander of cybernetics, and Stafford Beer, the creator of management cybernetics. The main difference between capitalism and socialism is that we have two organizations. The problem is they have two very different control structures. Using cybernetics, we want to know what is inside these two black boxes. Now, if you want to talk about controlling any organization effectively, you need to know about Ashbeys Law, also known as the law of requisite variety. Variety is a cybernetic technical term, and it talks about a measure of a system's complexity. It's the number of states a system can display. The law of requisite variety says, in matters of control, only variety absorbs variety. Look at the drawing. The regulated system on the left has more variety than the regulator. Notice their relative size. Now, according to this law of control, the only way the regulator can control the larger regulated system is by A, amplifying its own control variety, the bottom part of the graph, or B, filtering out some of the variety produced by the regulated system. Look at the top part where it says filter. So, the variety law is established in terms of amplifiers and filters. Control results when this variety equation is perfectly balanced. So now, the truly important difference between capitalism and socialism are the two radically opposite strategies for dealing with Ashbeys Law and the requisite variety equation. I will now proceed with a series of arguments, all having to do with this cybernetic law as a backdrop. Now, here is where Stafford Beer comes into the picture. He discovered the laws of viable systems that are the laws applicable to any system that is capable of an independent existence, such as all living things or human organizations. The exact same cybernetic laws apply to all of them, from a cell to an organ to a person to a business or a nation. Beer's model centers on the nervous system or the communication and control network of any viable system. Here is a much easier to understand model. I call it the Universal Management System 7 Model. I have added the physiological aspects of inputs and outputs to turn it into a transparent black box. Pardon the expression and the apparent contradiction. Borrowing from Stafford Beer, the UMS7 model says that there are 7 systemic functions in every viable organization and for every recursion level. These are identity, planning, the executive, the operation, coordination, anomaly or error detection, and security. Absent any one of these, the system dies sooner or later. It won't work efficiently or will not adapt to rapid changing circumstances. In the early 80s, while Stafford Beer and I were discussing about the viable system model, we mapped his viable system model against the constitutional government of the United States. Amazingly, the coincidence was outstanding. Today, translating that knowledge to the UMS7 model, we see that you have the people in the Constitution as the identity, then the Congress as an adaptation organ, the executive as a doer. Going into the operation, you can have the states as the next recursion levels or economic sectors, depending on what is your system in focus. In this case, the citizens play several other key roles. They are voters, and then they become the governed and subject to the laws enacted by their representatives and senators in Congress. The fit is amazing between the reality, a formal legality of a constitution, and the model of viable systems. Laws appear twice because some regulate the government internally and other laws apply to the citizens externally. Here is a spreading out of the model. As you can tell, the model is a replica of the usual political science theory that says that the state has three elements: the people, a government, and a territory. In the language of the VSM, these are exactly the system, the management, and the relevant environment. This arrangement sets up perfectly to apply Ashbeys' requisite variety law to connect all three elements. You can see how amplifiers and filters connect these elements in order to create a viable system, with requisite control variety doing its job to create balance. The very first argument in favor of capitalism I want to make in this video is this: whether you talk about capitalism or socialism, you are necessarily talking about a nation state. For instance, we talk about the gross national product or the rate of unemployment in a country. The organization under study is a nation state. It is a human organization. It is the so-called economy that produces goods and services, and the nation state is also subject to the laws of viability. Okay? So, an economy necessarily includes the people, the government, and the territory. So my first argument is that the nation state is an organization sometimes called the economy, and its control structure can better be studied using management cybernetics and the viable system model. Here are two extreme examples of a capitalist and a socialist nation state. The US is the capitalist state, and Cuba is the socialist state. Both claim to be democratic. Both claim to be oriented to serve the people. Again, it is the control structures inside the black boxes that make a huge difference. Argument number 2 goes as follows. The democratic, free nation state follows a recursive principle of organization and therefore shares the same control structure as human beings. People are free and have natural rights, and the people establish and control their government through a constitution. This graph shows capitalism's strategy to achieve requisite variety. See the amplifier on the top part. It includes the Constitution, elections, separation of powers, plus, in the bottom part, acting as filters are constitutional freedoms contained in the amendments. These are filters against certain types of governmental activity. For instance, the government cannot regulate religion, or confiscate firearms, or suppress the press or the freedom of ideas, speech, etc. We are witnessing here a model of Ashbeys Law at work in a very important real-life situation. Argument number 3 goes like this. Market economy is a very unfortunate and misleading misnomer. There is no economic system without a metasystem. In my book, The Cybernetic State, written in 1994, I showed that there is no such thing as a market economy. The misnomer comes from a 100% reductionist view where the economy is equal to some sort of production machinery involving men, materials, and money. But there cannot be a market economy without some sort of government. The government is an integral part of the unit called an economy. Stafford Beer predicted something as bad as the 2008 crisis would eventually happen. Rightly so. The regulated banks fell into a positive feedback trap. Those that didn't join would be obliterated by the competition. So no controls until nature took its course. The mortgage crisis and the system collapsed. Government intervened. Remember Alan Greenspan acting surprised when he said that he didn't know why the system did not correct itself. This dispels any notion that the government is not a part of the economy. When the 2008 financial crisis erupted, the government of the United States provided the remedy, showing its role as metasystemic regulator of the economy. Nevertheless, we have to notice that in the so-called free market economy, or the capitalist control system represented here, the people and the producers are in an accelerated control loop relationship. That is, the more people buy, the more the producers offer. This loop is controlled by nature. It runs until resources get depleted. This is a fundamental reason for switching to a circular economy where resources are reused and products are refurbished, renewed, and recycled. This is argument number 4. The basic role of government in capitalism is to facilitate the production-consumption cycle. If required, provide justice to settle disputes. In this graph, I introduce the government and the main role it plays in a capitalist country, showing that its control loop over the market's activity is tenuous. In fact, government amplifiers help business. For instance, intellectual property laws allow businesses to exploit their innovations undisturbed, helps the inventor, and keeps a check on hackers or thieves. Government is ready to enforce the fulfillment of private contracts, All this has to do with handling control variety constructively. In this way, the capitalist system's variety is made to explode. The government allows you to do your thing. It rewards your innovation, and the size of the government is kept as small as possible. Most of the regulation variety is provided by the production system itself, running as free as possible and in a self-organized way. Of course, a whole system consumes a lot of energy, but filters or prohibitions are kept at a minimum. People choose not to limit personal freedoms unless they have no other choice. This is why it is called a free enterprise system, except of course for the taxes and the food stamps, which are designed to keep the system running smoothly. Also, thank you. Argument number 5 says that freedom of contracts is capitalism's greatest tool. They provide requisite variety at the people level and solve millions of transactions a day without the need for metasystemic or governmental intervention. In the viable system, it is called the coordination function. It is indispensable. The human body uses autonomic control to lessen the burden of the brain. In practical terms, there are thousands of coordination solutions in society, and therefore the economy or the nation state. Among them, you can start by thinking in terms of dictionaries, agendas, schedules, bus and train routes, all sorts of contracts and standards. The capitalist system depends on freedom of contracts for dear life. The government's role is to settle disputes, but for every dispute there are literally millions of voluntary exchanges and transactions to be done. Contracts allow adjustments to changing circumstances. They solve many control problems without burdening the government. Here we see that the coordination function on the right is a recursive function. Every viable unit has its own coordination unit. This important systemic function starts at the highest levels of the nation-state in the shape of laws and regulations, and they then exist in production plants as production schedules, and they are active at the street level when people place an order in Amazon or eBay. The model you are looking at here can be the nation-state or a factory, or the internal structure of Amazon according to the types of products it sells. The same cybernetic control laws apply to all of them. Given the recursive nature of all viable organizations, business corporations, and even the nation-states, they all have the same equivalent communication and control connections as humans. To cybernetic laws, they are structurally the same. Although invented by lawyers, corporations become as real as a living person. Lawyers also put separation of powers into the US Constitution and came up with the protection of intellectual property, which is information that gives lives to things that seem inanimate. Argument number 6. The planning function has to do with learning and adaptation. Capitalism does not mess with centralized planning of production and services creation. Capitalism leaves learning and adaptation to individuals, corporations, and even to some public corporations also, but not as a centralized function. Planning is also labeled as intelligence in the Viable System Model and the Universal Management System 7 Model. It has to do with creating a necessary balance between the resources funneled to solve the here and now problems of production and the outside and then problems of adapting to a changing environment and producing learning at the organizational level. Capitalism is not very good at planning. The approach is still based on trial and error, and in modern times has to do more with creating capabilities than trying to predict the future. You create and you tear down. A lot of talk about creative destruction. Not very good at planning. Argument number 7. Capitalism equals a simple shared identity. Every viable system needs a shared identity to produce cohesion, a component of effectiveness. Identity is vital to decide what is private and what is a matter for public law. Free and private is the default setting of a capitalist identity. Your identity is the very first filter for your variety equation in dealing with your relevant environment. Identity sets the boundaries of the activities of any viable system, large or small. As a person, you are an American or Mexican or British or German or Russian, etc. You are a father, a son, a mother, a sister. You work as an engineer, actor, attorney, nurse, or pediatrician. Or referring identity to a company, your company builds bridges, toys, cars, or some other thing. This table presents a comparison between capitalism and socialism in regards to the laws of viability. Please study it carefully. Let's look really quickly at the mistakes made by Karl Marx in Das Kapital as predictor of history, and talk about the former Soviet Union as a socialist utopia. Well, Marxism was invented under the assumption that the world was a mechanical, billiard ball, predictable universe. This worldview was dominant when Marx wrote his Das Kapital. Marx was trying to predict future history based on past history. Big mistake. The world is not linear by any means. Marx mentions information 4 times in all his Das Kapital work, and he mentions knowledge not more than 10 times, and not in the way we know it today. Both words distance from the use we give them as something with intrinsic value. He is not to blame. Blame those who even today, sharing the same blindness and endorse socialism without knowing what it needs to make it work. An appalling and generalized loss of individual liberties in a crazed attempt to balance the variety equation. Efficacy, efficiency, homeostasis in every machine and everything with a purpose of its own needs information. You figure it out. There's no way Marxism can work. It goes against everything we know about complex systems and their behavior. We now know that the world is complex, chaotic, unpredictable, unstable. A solution today may turn out to be a headache tomorrow. Capitalism is better equipped to constantly adapt to changing circumstances. Absent from Marx and his Das Kapital was the modern view of the universe as made up of three things: energy, matter, and information. If you leave information out of the picture, your reasoning will not go very far. This graph shows how socialism tackles the variety equation. First of all, the amount of variety of each component is reversed. Now it is the government that has the highest total variety, and it uses it to suppress the people's variety, or freedom of choice, and the liberty to do many different things. It also suppresses the access to create production facilities which it owns. It is worth noting that in the socialist system, the people have no control over their government. The two loops we saw connected people and government in a democracy are absent in a socialist system. Socialism means precisely that the collective good has priority. The individual sacrifices him or herself to the group. However, once the controlling group takes over, it controls the bureaucracy and the individual disappears. He or she have no access to the seat of power, directly or indirectly. He or she have by now delegated their power to those in control. This is the reason why socialism becomes a closed system. Whatever control variety it has, it is used to lower the demand variety of the individual. The people put their trust in those in power, but the system has no adaptation, no learning, no self-auditing or self-correction. It runs blindly like the USSR did until it collapsed in 1989, all because of the lack of requisite variety in spite of the efforts to reduce demand variety. Instead of the people having the final control, it is the group in power who is in total control. Big control amplifiers are police systems, use of spies, etc. On the filtering side of the control loop, you have a huge bureaucracy to filter and slow down popular demands and a total lack of accountability. Government is oversized and macrocephalic and too busy regulating everything. The big difference between capitalism and socialism is that while capitalism amplifies variety and choice, socialism cancels variety and choice. They both try to satisfy Ashbeys Law of control, the control equation balance, but the strategy is totally different, totally reversed, actually the opposite. Socialism also has a big assumption. It assumes that the government can predict consumer variety and can then produce enough goods and services through centralized planning. Maybe capitalists also ignore the existence of Ashbeys Law, but they do not assume that they can satisfy the equation. They leave that to the markets to work it out. The intelligent the government lacks, they let the market provide it. After Norbert Wiener wrote his book on cybernetics in 1947, the engineers mathematicians and other USSR intellectuals became very enthusiastic about cybernetics. Later, during the Cold War, they tried again and again and again to set up a computerized system to plan and control all the production and match it with the demands of the Soviet people for goods and services. The story ends in a patchwork solution. It is called Internet, why the Soviet Union did not build a nationwide computer network. Little did they know that computers can be a menace if used incorrectly to generate perturbation variety instead of providing controlled variety. In this graph by Safer-Beer, computers contribute to provoke a system to go out of control. Look at the graphic and study it. Computers further amplify the variety that needs to be regulated, and the regulator gets swamped. The fallacy of computer omniscience is incurred by Peter Joseph and other famous American dissenters who assume that modern technology is capable of creating a socialist, centralized, planned economy where everybody gets its basic needs for free. Again, Peter, you are lacking requisite variety. One thing is to respond real time to some perturbation, and another very different is try to anticipate demand and be ready when it comes. As Russell Lakoff, the famous systems science consultant, said in UNAM in 2006, do not plan long term. Instead, develop capabilities to respond to whatever shows up. No socialist ideologist will ever even understand what these words mean, much less incorporate them into their mental maps. Another fallacy of socialist thinkers is to say that necessity is the mother of invention and conclude that innovation has nothing to do with free markets. Sorry, but I do not see the iPhone getting invented anywhere else but in the United States. People did not even know it was possible, so how could they have invented something they could not even imagine? Another important consideration to make in capitalism versus socialism is the moral and ethical unity of Christians against the dual morality of other non-Christian religions. This moral unity has important repercussions in terms of the control variety equation. When we realize that the viable system model, universal management model, business structure is a structure for absorbing variety, we see a chain of successive and increasing constraints from the identity flowing downwards all the way to the delivery of the product. Moral unity identity means that you see the consumer as your equal. In planning, it demands that your market research work with the truth as you find it. In execution, you care for the efficiency and reducing costs. In coordination, you turn top quality into a standard, and the error detection function is handed directly to the consumer, who can always return a product, no questions asked. then realize that capitalism is a very complex system, and this strategy for variety absorption creates the consumer's paradise, where all sales are 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. This is nothing else than granting total veto power to the consumer. We recall Stafford Beer's definition of government as a series of self-vetoing homeostates. Well, this capitalist extreme form of competitiveness is nowhere present in socialist governments or systems. By the way, Russell Acuff, our friend, was the consultant who noticed that it was cheaper to allow customers to return merchandise and get their money back than operate a consumer claims department. If you have any doubts, contrast an Apple store with many businesses on Fifth Avenue in New York City, establishments where every sale is considered a kill. All sales are as is and final. As to the future of capitalism, capitalism is safe from socialism taking over, more so given that the society continues to get more and more complex. Socialism's central planning and excessive control is the equivalent of a person with very limited brain power. It cannot learn as fast or not at all. It cannot innovate, it cannot recognize their mistake, or certainly cannot adapt on its own. Shown here is the UMS7 system, which is very close to describing the current structure of the capitalist nation state. This model, with its 7 systemic functions in place, works for any government organization and every business corporation, as I've already mentioned. Nobody debates the laws of motion. Nobody should debate the existence of gravity. Right, the same rigor applies to the laws of control. Once discovered, we cannot ignore them in anything we do. The future is a convergence towards the laws of viability and respecting the laws of control, and a convergence also between business and government, with private corporation management taking more and more government services responsibilities. It would be unfair not to mention capitalism's main problem. Problem number 1. I call it the emergent lie. Representative democracy is biased by campaign money. Now, the will of the people has been discussed by Stafford Beer in one of his lectures. It's in YouTube. You can watch it. It goes through a series of filters from territory to party to primaries to Congress to the leadership in Congress. All these filters act against true democracy. Here is a problem number 2. Capitalism is still too wasteful. It consumes a lot of resources, some of them not renewable. Pleasing the public in everything sounds very idealistic, but it is counterproductive in the long run and can lead to inescapable traps. Capitalism can have a recursive structure where cooperation and competition coexist depending on the recursion level. Capitalism will not cease to exist. It will just evolve naturally as the power of cybernetics, the super science of interconnectedness, enters the mainstream in the public's mind. Capitalism is a culture which must allow the people to have greater control over large companies and banks, and the government too. Adopting a circular and sustainable economy requires changing the mental models carried by millions of people in their heads. This challenge is augmented when capitalist countries allow the immigration of millions of people who do not work or are not interested in collaborating with the capitalist system they have joined. There is a limit to the number of free lunches a government can provide, and a threshold against free riders. Beyond that threshold, free riders will corrode the rest of the society in a tumor-like fashion until they destroy their host. This is not a problem of race, but a problem of a lack of alignment to reach shared goal. On the other hand, the Viable Systems Model law of cohesion helps explain why a country with a high mix of diversity would have a harder time creating enough cohesion for the people to trust the fair application of very high taxes to the middle class in order to turn it into a welfare state. And to quote Rand Paul, the more complete the socialism, the more complete the confiscation of property, the more force is necessary. In cybernetic terms, forced cohesion becomes inevitable when the purpose of a complex system requires sacrificing liberty. The problem with free riders is that they carry a dual ethical system. One applies in respect to the members of the group or tribe, and the other applies to the foreigners. So, we have to settle this problem soon. We cannot have a world split into givers and takers. A possible solution against the defects of representative democracy is one of Stafford's ideas about a government by infosets. In the digital age, democracy should be based on knowledge areas such as energy, infrastructure, transportation, transformation, telecommunications, commerce, recycling, etc., as shown here. Getting there will not be easy, but it would bring incredible savings to everybody. Capitalism's solution number 2 is making an effort to share mental models in balancing competition and cooperation, meaning sharing mental maps of how the world really works. This is what my movie Cybernetics is about, a map of the individual, the business, and the nation state. The Bible has the same model. You can be part of the problem, or you can be part of the solution. Capitalism solution number 3. The power of self-organization. Capitalism can lead the world towards peace and security for all. However, we must accept the fact, whether in gun control or the war on drugs, requisite variety usually is achieved by self-organization and self-control that starts at the individual person level. The state, in this case meaning the government's police apparatus, does not have, nor will it ever have, enough requisite variety to ensure that every single person within the nation-state's borders complies with every law in existence and all the time. And if your life depends on the state keeping you safe, you cannot risk it failing to do so. So, you protect yourself. I end this video with 2 new definitions of capitalism and socialism based on cybernetics. Capitalism is a self-organizing and adaptive bottom-up governance structure to facilitate the production and flow of goods and services that embodies VSM principles of organization such as recursiveness and maximum autonomy possible. Socialism, on the other hand, is any government structure centrally designed to control the production of goods and services, and it is not built from the bottom up, and it does not consider the individual as the basic building block, and is focused on constraining demands and consumption. The only valid test for evaluating any system, capitalist or socialist, is contained in Stafford Beer's admonition. The purpose of a system is what the system does. Look around you, and compare what different systems are doing. Then decide what you want for your future. Knowing the very basics of Ashbeys cybernetics is of enormous practical use today. Thinking in terms of requisite variety, amplifiers, filters, and black boxes allows you to understand the exact nature of the problems before you. Ashby says at the end of his book that any problem is always a problem of correct selection. Today, you made a good choice. Thank you. This is the end.